Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see y'all, and hopefully we'll be joined by some folks on video. We'll see what happens. We're going to begin with a word of prayer just to kind of guide our thinking this evening. So let's pray. God, we give you thanks for this opportunity to be with one another, this beautiful day that you've blessed us with, and for a time of study and a time of learning. And we just thank you for those that are here and for those that will join us here on Facebook, as well as the ones that will review this and share it on YouTube as well. So we're just thankful that we can be here and enjoy this day. And just guide us in tonight's lesson. In Christ's name, amen. If you had a chance, we did do one last week online. I forgot to notate it in any sort of fashion, but it should have come up as a notification. But the stories that we looked at last week are pretty familiar to us, I think, with the story of Joseph, because that's who we are with. I think the last time we were in here together, we stopped just before Joseph, and I said, I don't want us to go any farther, so we wanted to start with Joseph because he will sort of take us to the end of Genesis. And the story of Joseph is that really neat story of how God can use people, or how that God is with people. We know that Joseph was not the youngest son of Jacob, but next to the youngest son, wasn't he? He and Benjamin are the sons of, do you remember which woman? Jacob and Rachel, yeah. It was the woman, the wife that, the one he worked 14 years for. That's exactly right. And so Joseph, as I said last week, Joseph was kind of I think he was Dad's favorite, and everybody knew it, even him, didn't he? Because we realize that the story of Joseph is one that he tells these dreams. And remember the two dreams that he had? He went and revealed it to the brothers. And basically the dream said that you're going to do what? You're going to bow down to me. And while that happens, was it a good idea for him to tell the brothers that this was going to happen? Yeah, it kind of set it on a bad trajectory between him and his brothers anyway. I have a feeling that they didn't have a very good relationship at times already, because Dad kind of favored him more. And what really put the icing on the cake was, what do you think? What did Dad give him? He gave him a coat, didn't he? And it was not just any coat, was it? It was a very elaborate coat. We call it the coat of many colors many times. The old flannel board story that has the magical colors all over it, It's just, and we don't know if it was that ornate or not, but it was one that was ornate in some ways. That it was more fashionable than what you would normally wear. And it did reveal itself to be this present, this gift to Jacob that really sort of put him in a different place than the other brothers, didn't it? And so he has those dreams, and then, one time he goes out to the fields to meet his brothers, and as I said last week, I think he kind of managed what was going on. He didn't really do a lot of the work. And so he went out to check on them, and what was he wearing when he went out to check on them? He was wearing that coat. They're already upset with him. They already don't like him. And so he goes out with that coat, and then they plot to kill him, don't they? Eventually, they end up throwing him in a cistern, and they end up selling him, don't they? Sell him to some Ishmaelites that come in, and they go into Egypt, and they sell him to Potiphar. And Potiphar is one of the stories we remember, don't we? That Joseph becomes a slave in Potiphar's household, but because God is with him, it says, he ends up elevating himself to a high position in the household, doesn't he? Basically, he's kind of head over everything in the household, until his good looks become attractive to Potiphar's wife, who tries to have her way. Eventually, she ends up ripping his outer cloak off and kind of screams rape, and it ends up costing him, and he goes to where? prison, doesn't he? But in prison, he is in favor of God, isn't he? God loves him. And so he finds favor with the prison warden who puts him in charge over all the prisoners. He sort of manages that particular area there. And one of the things that we remember about Joseph will be, and that's where we're going to start in chapter 40, is Joseph is an interpreter of dreams, isn't he? And those dreams kind of are God's way that he speaks to Joseph. Because when we think about those two dreams he had in front of his brothers, what were they? The one with the corn that bowed down, and the other was what? The sun, the moon, and the stars would all bow down to him. And so it kind of signified all of this. So right now, when we get into chapter 40, Joseph is in prison. He's been there for a while. But it says that the Lord, at the end of the text of chapter 39, says, the Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. And we see that as he did succeed in Potiphar's house, it wasn't that he did anything, did he? It's that he got deceived by Potiphar's wife, and it infuriated Potiphar, who sent him to prison. He succeeds as a prisoner that he can manage the particular prisoners that are there. And so now we find that in chapter 40 it says, sometimes later that Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. And basically a cupbearer is just a glorified butler in some way. He kind of takes care of Pharaoh, manages his looks and what he drinks and eats, and more than likely he would be the one to test it before Pharaoh drank it to make sure it wasn't what? Poison, wasn't it? And it seems a little like an odd job that you really want to have, but it's a pretty high position job, and if you can do it, you do it. So it says these two offended their royal master, and Pharaoh became angry with these officials and placed them in prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. So it's one note here says that Joseph, and it'll tell us where these guys are. Joseph was placed in a facility specifically used to retain prisoners of Pharaoh or of the state. So it's kind of like a federal prison in a sense, is what it might be. The prison was either a round tower or a fortress with possibly part of Potiphar's house. Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker were high-ranking servants who also ended up there after offending their master. So there's a little bit to tell us about that. It's not just a run-of-the-mill prison. It's a prison for special prisoners who have offended either the state or the Pharaoh himself. And Pharaoh might have just at times it didn't take much. He probably could just throw you in. I mean, he's Pharaoh, isn't he? You know, he's the head of Egypt. He can do whatever he wants to. He doesn't like you. You're done. You're going to prison. So they remained in prison, it says, for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. This is going to benefit them in a moment, isn't it? That they are under the watchful eyes of Joseph. While they were in prison, both of them, Pharaoh's cupbearer and the baker, each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed that they both looked upset. "Why do you look so worried today?" he asked them. And they replied that they both had dreams, but no one can tell us what they mean. So undoubtedly they've been talking to people, haven't they? Kind of short. I guess that in that time, dreams meant something different than what we think about today, don't we? You know, we don't. You know, if you have a nightmare or a strange dream, you don't think about it much, do you? Most of the time, you don't even remember it. But here, it kind of meant something. And so they have these dreams that have become very worrisome to them. And so they are not able to find somebody that can tell them what they mean, who can interpret them. To which Joseph says, interpreting dreams is God's business. So go ahead and tell me your dream. So it's his way to communicate with God or have God communicate with him. And this has put Joseph in a special position too, hasn't it? And it will be in just a little bit. So the cupbearer tells his story first, or his dream first. He said, "In my dream, I saw a grapevine, and in front of me. And the vine had 3 branches that began to bud and blossom. And soon it produced clusters of ripe grapes. I was holding Pharaoh's wine cup in my hand, so I took a cluster of grapes and squeezed the juice into the cup. And then I placed the cup into Pharaoh's hand. I don't know what that means right off, do you? He's just squeezing grapes into somebody's cup, isn't he? But it has a meaning, doesn't it? So Joseph says, here's what that dream means. The 3 branches represent 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as chief cupbearer. Hey, that's a great dream, isn't it? Wow. In 3 days, I'm out of here. And not only is he going to be out of there, but he's going back to his regular job. He's going back to who he was. He's not having to step down in position. He's going to be back where he was. So Joseph also tells him, though, because he knows that he's getting to be released, he's going to go back to Pharaoh. He says, and please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh. Give a good word to Pharaoh about me so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it. I mean, he was a bad brother, wasn't he? He was kind of an obnoxious brother, but really everything he's done he didn't deserve where he's at, does he? And what's happened to him. He deserves a good kick in the pants sometimes from Dad, but, not to be placed in prison where he is. So that's what he says. I'm here, and can you at least put in a good word for me? So now the chief baker sees Joseph had given the first dream such a positive interpretation. What's the chief baker thinking? If he hears that the chief cupbearer is getting a good word, what's he thinking? He's saying, I'm going to get one too. Yes. So what does he say? I had a dream too. In my dream, there were 3 baskets of white pastry stacked on top of my head. The top basket contained all kinds of pastries for Pharaoh, but the birds came and ate them from the basket on my head. Can I have a good word about that? What does the dream mean? Joseph tells him. The 3 baskets also represent 3 days. 3 days from now, Pharaoh will lift you up and impale your body on a pole. What does that mean? It means your execution date's near, isn't it? You're not going to be so fortunate. And then the birds will come and peck away at your flesh. I wonder how he feels as he walks away for those next 3 days. The chief cupbearer is feeling pretty good about himself, isn't he? Probably got a little, spring in his step and feeling pretty good. And chief baker is going, sit down. I don't want to see it. So it says in verse 20, Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later, and he prepared a banquet for all of his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position so he can again hand Pharaoh his cup. And I think it's neat that 3 days that there's this birthday, there's this party, there's this gathering of officials. And what a way to welcome back your chief cupbearer, right? You do it in front of everybody and say, here's his restoration in some way. Not so much for the chief baker, though. It says, but Pharaoh impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph's dream predicted when he interpreted his dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot about Joseph, never giving him another thought. Poor Joseph. All that he's been through. He just said, can you just do this one little thing for me? Can you do one little thing and just remember to tell Pharaoh? In 3 days is all it is. But the cupbearer is probably pretty excited, isn't he? Because of what's just happened to him. Chief baker, not so much, is he? He's outside on a pole. So, that's the story that will lead us up to where Joseph's real redemption sort of comes into play, doesn't it? His opportunity to do something great now after all he's been doing. I mean, when you think about it, think about what all he's done. He has risen in the ranks of Potiphar's house because God was with him. He's risen in the ranks of a prisoner because God is with him. And now we're going to see that it's all going to culminate in this next step in his life. It says 2 full years later. 2 years later, Joseph's still in there, it says. Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows coming out of the river and begin grazing on the marshland. Then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood behind the fat cows on the bank. And then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up. Now, when you think about it, it doesn't seem like a nightmare, does it? It just seems like a weird dream that Pharaoh is having here. It says he falls back asleep and he has a second dream. This time he sees 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. So in each instance, there's 7 good and there's 7 bad, isn't it? And we know the story. We know how this is going to be revealed to us. But it's interesting, the simplicity of the dream and trying to figure out what it is. And so the 7 cows, healthy cows, are eaten by the 7 scrawny, the 7 heads, good heads, and 7 bad are all blown into one particular area. So the next morning it says Pharaoh, and this is verse 8, was very disturbed by his dreams. So he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. And when Pharaoh told them his dreams, not one of them could count or could tell him what they meant. Because when you think about it, they're not supposed to answer this dream, are they? Who is? It's intended, I think, for Joseph, don't you? There's a special reason why these magicians and these wise men could not answer these dreams. And I would assume that they probably had a pretty good record of interpreted dreams sometimes. Because that's what they're for in that court. Or he wouldn't keep them, would he? But in this particular instance, they can't answer it. Because undoubtedly this is a dream that he's having that God has put into his mind, isn't it? And the only person that can answer this dream is going to be who? Joseph. So he calls them and he says, finally, after 2 years, the chief cupbearer spoke up. Today I've been reminded of my failure. His failure is, I forgot about this dude for 2 years. Some time ago, you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night, the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant. And everything happened just as he had predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from prison. Now look what he had to do. After he was shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and he stood before Pharaoh. You couldn't just go in there ragged and tattered, could you? Look like a homeless man or something. Or somebody that was dirty and stinky. You had to look pretty good to go in front of Pharaoh, didn't you? And so that's what happened here. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night, and no one here can tell me what it means. But I have never heard that but I have heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. So Joseph answered this way. Joseph says, it's beyond my power to do this. It's not me that can do this. I can't answer your dream, but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. Now I'll speak for God, and God will speak through me, but it's not me that's answering this. It's not me that's interpreting this dreams. I can't do that. In a way, Joseph's saying, I'm merely a human, but I worship a God. I trust a God. I believe in a God that can answer these dreams for you. So, what's he say? Tell them to me. So Pharaoh told Joseph his dreams. In my dream, he said, I was standing at the bank of the Nile River, and I saw 7 fat, healthy cows come out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. But then I saw 7 sick-looking cows, scrawny and thin, come up after them. I've never seen such sorry-looking animals in all the land of Egypt. These thin, scrawny cows ate the 7 fat cows, but afterwards you wouldn't have known it, for they were still thin and scrawny as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. The 7 more heads of grain appeared, but they were blighted, shriveled, and withered by the east wind. And the shriveled heads swallowed the 7 healthy heads. I told these dreams to the magicians, but no one could tell me what they meant. That's because they weren't supposed to. Joseph responded in this way. He said, Pharaoh, both of these dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he's about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity for Egypt. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind represent 7 years of famine. One note here says, Egypt rarely had severe famine, so the thought of a 7-year famine seemed impossible to the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Because it says the Nile River flooded annually, providing fertile soil and adequate water for the region. They had the Nile River, in other words, which always continued to flow. And I've read stories and seen other things that said that what they'll do is they grow the crops near the Nile, and they'll dig tributaries and waterway, little canals that they can continue to water all of these fields. So it always stays fertile in that land. So yes, it would have been surprising for them to realize, we shouldn't have a famine. We never had famine. We always had good. Other regions of the world, it says, might have had those because they didn't have the same water source. So it threw them off a little bit. But Joseph here says, you're going to have 7 years of prosperity and you're going to have 7 years of famine. That's coming up. So what does he say? He says in verse 28, this will happen just as I described it, for God has revealed it to Pharaoh in advance, what he's about to do. So the next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterwards there'll be 7 years of famine, so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land, and this famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having 2 similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God and will soon make them happen. If you had one, it might meant, it could happen. But if you got 2, it means one of them corroborates the other, doesn't it? And so, in other words, Joseph is saying, if you get 2 dreams that are alike, that mean the same thing, it means it's going to happen, doesn't it? Is basically what he's saying. So he says, therefore Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Part of me is wondering if Joseph is kind of puffing his chest out a little bit and go, he should find an intelligent and wise man to do this. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of the crops during the 7 years, good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land. Joseph already knows what needs to be done, doesn't he? Because, Joseph's been a manager, hasn't he? I think he managed the household of Jacob at times. I think that's why he wasn't out with the livestock very often. You saw the brothers, that he sent them there. I have a feeling that's what he was doing. He might have worked with them some, but I don't think he got his hands as dirty as the other brothers did. So I think he had that managerial experience there. Then he had the management experience in Potiphar's house, didn't he? Now we realize in his case, he says it's because God was there with him. But it still elevated him in the house of Potiphar, didn't it? As he goes to prison, he starts at the bottom, but the guards see something in him and elevates him to be in charge of all the prisoners, doesn't he? So there's something about Joseph's intelligence and wisdom that's there that is God ordained, that is God with him, but it still gives him that opportunity to do something great. His wisdom, his intelligence, and I'm sure there's charisma that he has that he just exudes this and makes people listen and stand up and listen to him. So he kind of comes up with the idea of what needs to be done. And then in verse 37, Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, "Can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God?" And remember, they didn't worship God in Egypt. They worshiped many gods. But they would have counted this God as one of them when they see what happens. And this Pharaoh sort of lifts him up as part of this. So he says, then Pharaoh says to Joseph, "Since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are." Okay, Jacob, in a way, isn't it? No one is as intelligent and wise as you are. So you will be in charge of my court, and all of my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. This guy is a Hebrew, isn't he? He's not even Egyptian. He's not even one of them. But Pharaoh says, you have something that they don't, and I'm putting you in charge. And not only is he in charge of these men, the only person that is above him is who? Pharaoh himself. As you say, he's second in command of all of Egypt. Second only to Pharaoh right now. From a guy who started in the field, whose brothers despised him and were about to kill him, who threw him in a cistern, sold him into slavery, who was put into prison, now rises to the rank of second in command of all of Egypt. God was truly with Joseph, wasn't he? And elevated him into these various positions, put him in a place of power for such a time as this, we might say. And as we continue to move into the story, and we see how what his power gives him, we're going to see how it sort of gives us opportunity for reconciliation at some point, doesn't it? With him and his brothers and his family. So it's a very neat story, the story of Joseph, isn't it? And I think that's why it has it's given so much of the book of Genesis, is to see what God can do. But it also is to kind of put the people into Egypt so that we can have the book of Exodus in a way too, isn't it? Because that's what the book of Exodus is going to be about. You've got to get them into Egypt. And so this is part of how we get them there. All right, so we are on verse 41. Pharaoh says to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt." And then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger, which gives him the symbol of who he is, of his power now. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, "Kneel down." So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to him, "I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or a foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval." Man, that's power, isn't it? And that's what he's going to do. Joseph is put there to oversee Egypt's sustainability during this time of famine, to help get them into the place where they can go through these 7 years without a hitch, basically. Then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it. It's just Zaphanath-Paneah, I guess is what it is. It's in one place it says, it's got a star in my Bible, which says it possibly means God speaks and lives. I guess there's really no translation from that Egyptian word at that time, but that's what they're kind of thinking it could be. He also gave him a wife whose name was Asenath. She was the daughter of Potiphera, who was the priest of On. So Joseph took charge of the entire land of Egypt. He was only 30 years old when this happened. When he began serving the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and when Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land of Egypt. So 47 tells us, as predicted, for 7 years, the land produced bumper crops during those years. And remember, how much is he taking? It says what? 1/5 of all the crops in those, during that time. 1/5 of it. So you're living off 4/5 wherever, and then you're collecting that 1/5. So during those years, it says Joseph gathered all the crops grown in Egypt and stored the grain from the surrounding fields in the cities. He piled up huge amounts of grain like sand on the seashore. Finally, he stopped keeping records because there was too much to measure. He didn't have enough hands and toes to do it, did he? I was going to say, did he, Larry? But so he had to quit measuring. He said, it's a bunch in here. That's all he said. During that time, before the first of the famine years, 2 sons were born to Joseph and his wife. He named the elder son Manasseh and the other one Ephraim. Manasseh meant God has made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family, which is sort of a weird thing, isn't it, to say to forget your family. But then he named the second one Ephraim, which means God has made me fruitful in this land of my grief. Makes sense. And at last, the 7 years of bumper crops throughout the land of Egypt came to an end, and then the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had predicted. The famine also struck all the surrounding countries, it says, but throughout Egypt there was plenty of food. Eventually, however, the famine spread throughout the land of Egypt. So undoubtedly what they were doing was people probably themselves stored some up, didn't they? But at some point theirs begins to dry out, and now you're going to have to open the storehouses, aren't you? So severe the famine was that Joseph opened up the storehouses and distributed grain to all the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout the land of Egypt, and people from all around Egypt came to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was so severe throughout the world. You've got people coming in from surrounding countries to Egypt to buy. Pharaoh's going to get rich through this, isn't he? I mean, it's going to be, but when you think about it, there must have been a heck of a lot of grain and food stored up to be able to not only feed the people of Egypt during that 7-year period, but to feed other people too. It has a lot, isn't it? But it did say it was going to be 7 years of prosperity, didn't it? Of bumper crops, meaning possibly that they had never seen so much produce at one time. And Joseph was able to store up what he could. So it fascinates me to think about how much there must have been that was gathered, in that time with them. So the next of the story is going to be about Joseph's brothers. And I know it's just 7:34, but I'm going to stop there because I want to lump the brothers together into 1 week. Now, we're not going to meet next week because next week is Passion Week. It's Easter week. We've got a lot going on. So there won't even be an online Bible study next week. We'll come back the week after and we'll talk about Joseph's brothers and the story of them coming down into Egypt and what happens. It's funny to think about it because we know what happens, don't we? But it's fun to read these stories again and just reimagine all the incidents that took place. So we're seeing this rise to power of Joseph, and it's a very interesting, unique story, isn't it, to see what's happened. And when we think about all that happened to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob himself, but nothing like what's happened to Joseph. For them, God has carried them every step of the way, but it never seemed like they had any sort of hiccup along the way, or something that really put them in a low spot, much like Joseph. But none of them really rise to the same ranks of power as what Joseph does, do they, in that sense? So, we'll think about that as we see what happens with the brothers. The brothers who sold him into slavery are part of the country that's going to be experiencing famine, and they're going to have to come, and they're going to have to see Joseph. Joseph, who at one time said, "You're going to bow down to me." All of a sudden, they've got to come to Joseph because they're hungry. And so that's what we'll get to the next time. So thanks a lot for watching. I see a couple people just joining me, but hey, you'll have to go back and look at it in a little bit. So, all right. Take care, guys.